The Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. In the year 1775, social ills plagued both France and England. Jerry Cruncher, an odd job man who works for Tellson's Bank, stops the Dover mail coach to read an urgent message for Mr. Jarvis Lorry. The message instructs Mr. Lorry to wait at Dover for a young woman, and he responds with the cryptic words, "Recalled to life." At Dover, Mr. Lorry met Lucy Manette, a 14-year-old orphan, whose father was an eminent doctor whom she supposed dead, but has been discovered in France. Lorry escorts Lucy to Paris, where they meet Defarge, the former servant of Dr. Manette, and the one who has kept Dr. Manette safe in a garret. When Mr. Lorry and Lucy Manette arrived at a Paris wine shop owned by the Defarges, they come across a barrel of wine spilled into the street, and the people were racing towards it because they can't afford to buy some. And not long while, Mr. Lorry and Lucy Manette went inside the wine shop. Mr. Defarge and Madame Defarge were talking to three men called the Jacks, and they were revolutionaries, and Madame Defarge and Mr. Defarge were also revolutionaries, and in fact, they are the leaders of the revolutionary movement. After the three men left, they went upstairs, and Lucy Manette met her father, who was driven mad because he was imprisoned for 18 years in the Bastille, and all of his time he spent it doing his hobby of making shoes. And upon seeing her father, Mr. Lorry assures Lucy Manette that her love and devotion will make her father recalled to life, and indeed they do, because as soon as Dr. Manette saw his daughter, he was reminded of his wife because of the blonde hair and the blue eyes of Lucy Manette. And there, they hugged each other and they both cried. 5 years later, the year is now 1780, Charles Darnay stands accused of treason against English crown. A bombastic lawyer named Stryver pleads Darnay's case, but not until his drunk and good-for-nothing colleague, Sidney Carton, assists him that the court acquits Darnay. And Sidney Carton clinches his argument by pointing out that he himself has an uncanny resemblance to the defendant, which undermines that Charles Darnay must have been unmistakably identified as the spy that the authorities has spotted. And that's the reason why the court decided to acquit Darnay's case, because Charles Darnay and Sidney Carton really look exactly the same. Lucy and Dr. Manette watched the court proceedings, and that night, Carton escorts Darnay to a tavern and asks how it feels to receive a sympathy from a woman like Lucy. After the court proceedings, Dr. Manette, Lucy Manette met with Charles Darnay and Sidney Carton outside, and Dr. Manette and Lucy Manette sympathized Charles Darnay because he was accused for something that he did not do in the first place. And knowing that Sidney Carton admires Lucy Manette for a very long time, he was jealous because Lucy Manette sympathized Charles Darnay. In France, the cruel Marquis Evremond runs down a plebeian child with his carriage. Marquis Evremond was a cruel French aristocrat who really does not show any mercy, especially to the poor. And what he did at that time was really annoying, because he just threw a gold coin to the father of the child, who was crying because his child died on the spot. And the father got mad because of how Marquis Evremond acted, and Madame Defarge and Mr. Defarge witnessed that event, and some says that it was Madame Defarge who threw the gold coin back to the carriage of Marquis Evremond. And later on, Marquis Evremond went on his way to his home because he was waiting for his nephew. Arriving later that night, Darnay curses his uncle and the French aristocracy for its abominable treatment of the people. So, he renounces his identity as an Evremond and announces his intention to return back to England. So, after that, he really went to England, and his uncle Marquis Evrémonde was left, and that night Marquis Evrémonde was killed in his bed, and the murderer left a note signed with a nickname from the French revolutionaries, the Jacques. But actually, the one who killed Marquis Evrémonde was not the revolutionaries, nor Madame Defarge and Mr. Defarge, but it was the father of the child, because he hurriedly went under the carriage as soon as Marquis Evrémonde went on his way back home. A year passes. Charles Darnay asks Dr. Manette for permission to marry Lucy, and he says that if Lucy accepts, he will reveal his true identity to Dr. Manette. Meanwhile, Carton, who really knew that he really have no chance to Lucy Manette, because there was really something going on between Charles Darnay and Lucy Manette ever since their first meet-up in the court proceedings. And Carton admits to Lucy that even though his life is worthless, she has helped him dream a better and more valuable existence. In Paris, another English spy known as Jean Barsad went into the Defarges' wine shop because he was hoping that he will find some evidence about the mounting revolution, but he was clueless as Madame Defarge was just sitting there and she was knitting, but her knitting style was not that the usual knitting type, but she was knitting the names of the people that she really hoped to die. Back in London, Darnay, on the morning of his wedding, kept his promise to Dr. Manette, and there he revealed his true identity, that he was the nephew of the French aristocrat who was one of the person who imprisoned Dr. Manette in the Bastille for 18 years. And because of that, Dr. Manette went back to his hobby of making shoes. But after 9 days, he recovered and he regains his presence of mind and joined the newlyweds on their honeymoon. Upon Darnay's return, Carton pays him a visit and asks for friendship. And then Darnay responded to him that he is always welcome in their home. The year is now 1789. The peasants in Paris storm the Bastille and the French Revolution begins. And every aristocrat in the street was killed mercilessly by the peasants. And Gabelle, who was tasked to continue the Evrémonde estate, was imprisoned. And 3 years later, he wrote to Darnay. He was asking for help. He was asking to be rescued. And despite of the threat and the danger, Darnay immediately went to France to help and rescue his friend Gabelle. As soon as Darnay arrives in Paris, the French revolutionaries arrest him as an immigrant. Lucy and Dr. Manette went to Paris in order to save him, but Darnay remains in prison for 1 year and 3 months before receiving a trial. In order to help free him, Dr. Manette uses his considerable influence to the French revolutionaries, who sympathized with him for being imprisoned in the Bastille for a very long time, and that's why Charles Darnay was acquitted. But at that same night, he got arrested again. But this time it was not because of the revolutionaries, but it was because of Mr. Defarge and his vengeful wife, Madame Defarge. So Carton arrives in Paris with a plan to help and rescue Darnay and obtain help from Jean Barsad, who turns out to be Solomon Brosse, the long-lost brother of Lucy Manette's loyal servant, Miss Brosse. At Darnay's trial, Defarge produces a letter that he discovered in Manette's old jail cell in the Bastille, and the letter explains the cause of Manette's imprisonment. The letter says that years ago, the Evrémonde brothers, Charles Darnay's uncle and father, had asked medical assistance from Dr. Manette in order to heal the woman whom one of the brothers had raped and her brother whom they fatally stabbed. But they feared that Dr. Manette might report their misdeeds to the authorities, so they have him arrested instead. And they imprisoned him in the Bastille for 18 years. And so the treatment of the woman that they raped and the brother that they had stabbed was cut, and then both of them died. Upon hearing the story, the jury condemns Darnay for the crimes of his ancestors and sentences him to die within 24 hours. That night at the Defarges wine shop, Carton overhears Madame Defarge plotting to have Lucy and her daughter executed as well. So, Carton arranges Manette's immediate departure from France, and he then visits Darnay in prison, and he tricks him into changing clothes with him, and he explained to him about the letter, that it turns out that it was Madame Defarge was the surviving sibling of the man and woman that was killed by the Evremonts, which is the father and uncle of Charles Darnay. And after his explanation, he drugged his friend unconscious. And Jean Barsad carried Charles Darnay, now disguised as Sidney Carton, to an awaiting coach or carriage, while Sidney Carton, disguised as Charles Darnay, now awaiting for the execution. As Darnay, Lucy, their child, and Dr. Manette speed away from Paris, Madame Defarge arrived at Lucy's apartment, and there she finds the supremely protective Miss Pross, the loyal servant of Lucy. And a scuffle ensues, and Miss Pross heard it, and she knew that Madame Defarge was planning to do something bad, so she grabbed the rifle and she pulled the trigger to the head of Madame Defarge, and that's how she got killed, and she died on the bullet of her own gun. Sadly, Sidney Carton meets his death at the guillotine, and that's how the French Revolution ended also, because the French revolutionaries really thought that it was Charles Darnay at the guillotine, but it was Sidney Carton disguised as Charles Darnay. And the narrator confidently asserts that Carton dies with the knowledge that he has finally imbued his life with meaning.